his wife, his father, their secrets. At first, just glances. Then, touches. But at night, he heard her laughter in his father's room. Betrayal. The recording confirmed everything. We need him to want to leave on his own. The next morning, he sat across from his father. What do you think Mirabella will say when she hears this? Fredrin smirked. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. But revenge had already begun. Eamon stood by the kitchen table, slowly stirring his coffee. The smell of toasted bread filled the air, but he had no appetite. His thoughts revolved around today, the day his father was coming to stay with them for an indefinite period. Fredrin, whom he hadn't seen for almost a year, was a completely different person from his son. Tall, muscular, always confident. He seemed like the kind of man who had all the answers in life. After Eamon's mother passed away, Fredrin didn't appear broken. On the contrary, he started working on himself even more, looked younger than his age, and even had something akin to charm. Honey, do you think he'll like our living room? Mirabella's voice rang out. Eamon looked up. His wife stood by the mirror, brushing her long blonde hair. She was wearing a short home dress that hugged her figure nicely. I think so, he replied, taking a sip of coffee. He's not too picky about those things. Mirabella smiled, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. I heard your dad is in great shape now. Eamon tensed for a second. Yeah, he always keeps himself fit, he said, trying to ignore the tone in which it was said. Mirabella walked up to him, wrapped her arms around his neck, and quickly kissed his cheek. He's not that old yet, is he? Eamon couldn't find the right response because, at that moment, the doorbell rang in the hallway. He sighed, put down his cup, and went to open the door. His father stood on the doorstep. Fredrin looked impeccable. A gray cashmere sweater, dark jeans, expensive cologne, a light smile. His physique didn't match his age. Broad shoulders, a toned stomach, arms that revealed hours of training. Hey, son, he said, patting Eamon on the shoulder and stepping inside. Hi, Dad, Eamon replied, but his words didn't sound very confident. Fredrin glanced around the apartment. Nice place you have here, cozy. We tried, Mirabella said, stepping into the hallway. Eamon immediately noticed how Fredrin's gaze lingered on her, just a bit longer than it should have. His father smiled and then slowly stepped closer. And you have such a wonderful wife, he said with a barely noticeable hint of admiration. Eamon clearly noticed how Mirabella straightened her back, adjusted her hair, and put on her most charming expression. Very nice to meet you, Fredrin. Likewise, Mirabella, he said, his voice soft, too soft. A slight chill ran down Eamon's spine. The day passed in conversations, dinner, and Fredrin's amusing stories about his work and travels. Mirabella listened intently to every word, laughed at the right moments, and even asked for more details now and then. Eamon watched. At first, he dismissed it as his wife's natural friendliness. But then he started noticing the little things. How she glanced at Fredrin more often. How her smile was a bit wider than usual. How she occasionally touched her hair when Fredrin looked at her. How her laughter rang out just a little too brightly. In the evening, they sat on the couch watching a movie. Fredrin had brought a bottle of wine, and Mirabella happily supported the idea. Let me pour you some, Fredrin offered, and his fingers barely brushed against her hand as he handed her the glass. Eamon noticed, and he noticed that Mirabella didn't pull her hand away. He sat in silence, pretending nothing was happening. They sat together, the three of them, but he felt like the odd one out. When the movie ended, Fredrin stood up and stretched. Well, I suppose it's time for me to sleep. Yes, it's been a long day, Mirabella agreed. Fredrin went to his room, and Mirabella stood up from the couch, stretching as if she were tired. Eamon stood up as well. She walked up to him, lightly running her fingers across his chest. I hope you don't mind your dad staying with us? No, it's fine, he said, studying her eyes carefully. He's so interesting, she said, brushing her lips gently against his. Eamon didn't reply. That night, he couldn't fall asleep for a long time. And when he woke up in the middle of the night, he saw that Mirabella was not in bed. His heart started pounding faster. He got up, stepped into the hallway, and stopped in front of the guest room where his father was sleeping. The door was slightly ajar. and from the darkness, he heard muffled laughter. Eamon's eyes narrowed. He took a step closer, held his breath, but he didn't open the door just yet. Eamon stood in the darkness, breath held. From the slightly open door of the guest room, muffled laughter echoed. Light, playful, almost intimate. His heart pounded in his chest. He tried to hear more, but the voices were too quiet. Mirabella and Fredrin were speaking softly, almost whispering to each other. For a moment, Eamon thought he was imagining the worst, that his wife and father were simply laughing at some innocent joke. But then he heard a sound, a soft, barely audible rustle, as if someone's fingers had slowly brushed against fabric, and another, a quiet, deep inhale. Something tightened in his chest. He could open the door right now and see. He could erase all doubts with a single glance. But instead, he took a step back and returned to his bedroom. Something inside him whispered, it wasn't time yet. The next morning, Eamon woke up later than everyone else. When he walked into the kitchen, he saw Fredrin and Mirabella already having breakfast. His father sat at the table, leaning back in his chair, a faintly self-satisfied look on his face. Mirabella stood by the stove, making more coffee. She was wearing a silk robe that barely covered her legs. "Good morning, son," Fredrin said, taking a sip of coffee. "Morning," Eamon replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Mirabella turned to him, smiling. "How did you sleep, darling?" "Good," he lied. Fredrin gave him a quick glance, and for a split second, something like curiosity flickered in his eyes. "Mirabella and I have already had a little chat," he said. "She's a wonderful hostess." Eamon noticed how his father subtly winked at his wife. Mirabella blushed just slightly. Something about her had changed. Eamon could see it. She looked enlivened. Her movements became smoother, her smile different. Not the one she used to give him. He silently sat down at the table and picked up his cup. "Are you working from home today?" she asked. "Yes," he nodded, watching her. Fredrin casually ran his hand over his watch, which looked far too expensive for just an accessory. "Mirabella and I were thinking of taking a walk around the city," he said. "Oh," was all Eamon managed to say. She didn't even ask if he wanted to join them. Something inside him went cold. "Well, have a great time," he said, pretending it didn't bother him. But it did. They didn't return until evening. Eamon sat at his laptop, but work wasn't progressing. He kept catching himself imagining how Mirabella and Fredrin spent the day, how she laughed at his jokes, how they walked side by side, maybe brushing shoulders, how Fredrin might have placed his hand on her back, guiding her forward. When the door finally opened, he heard their voices. They were talking and laughing. "That was wonderful," Mirabella said, taking off her coat. Fredrin smiled and handed her a small bag. "I hope you like it." She pulled out a delicate gold bracelet. Eamon saw her eyes light up. "Fredrin, this is too much." "Nonsense," he waved it off. Eamon closed his laptop. "What's this?" Mirabella lifted the bracelet, showing it to him. "A gift." "A gift?" he repeated, trying to keep his tone even. Fredrin smiled. "Just a small token of appreciation for welcoming me into your home." "That should have been my initiative," Eamon said, not breaking eye contact. But Fredrin wasn't fazed. "Well, you know me," he shrugged slightly. "I love surprising women with little gifts." Eamon didn't respond, but he knew this was only the beginning. Over the next few days, Eamon watched closely. He saw how Mirabella laughed at Fredrin's words, even when they weren't funny. He saw how she looked at him just a little longer than necessary. He saw how she started paying more attention to her appearance when she knew Fredrin would be around. His wife was changing. She was fascinated by another man, his own father. But what struck him the most was one particular moment. One evening, as they all sat in the living room, Fredrin absent-mindedly placed his hand on Mirabella's knee. Just for a second. But it was enough. She didn't pull away. She didn't react. She simply continued the conversation as if nothing had happened. Eamon pretended not to notice. But inside, something snapped. That night, he lay awake for a long time, staring into the darkness. He could say something. He could ask her directly. But no, he wouldn't do that. Not yet. He would just wait. And when the time came, he would do something they wouldn't expect. Eamon felt something inside him slowly shifting. Every day brought new little details that formed a bigger picture. Mirabella had changed. At first, it was just the glances. Longer than usual. Too attentive when Fredrin spoke. Then, the laughter. Too bright, too genuine. A kind of laughter she hadn't given him, her husband, in a long time. And then, the physical contact. Subtle touches that seemed accidental at first. Her hand barely brushing against Fredrin's palm when he handed her something. Fingers lingering on his hand for a second, too long when they said goodnight. Eamon couldn't say for sure if this was already betrayal, but he felt his world slowly falling apart. And what irritated him the most was that no one was even trying to hide it. He started watching more closely. Mirabella began waking up earlier when Fredrin was home. She started wearing beautiful dresses without any particular reason. Her perfume became more intense. But every time she returned to their bedroom, she was colder than before. Eamon decided to act. One evening, he stepped out onto the balcony and discreetly took out his phone. Fredrin and Mirabella were in the living room, and he turned on the voice recorder. They were speaking quietly, but he heard every word. "You're very generous, Fredrin." Her voice had a soft, almost purring tone. "I simply appreciate beauty," he replied. A few seconds of silence. Then, a light laugh. "If Eamon finds out, he won't," Fredrin interrupted her. "He's not the kind of man to suspect anything." Eamon's heart clenched. He turned off the recording and stepped back inside. It felt as though something invisible had settled in the air. Fredrin sat on the couch, relaxed, confident. Mirabella stood nearby, biting her lip. She knew she had already gone too far, and that her husband was beginning to suspect. But he wouldn't show it. Not yet. The next morning, he pretended to leave for work. But instead, he got into his car, parked nearby, and started waiting. 10 minutes later, their apartment door opened. Mirabella stepped out. She was dressed too elegantly for just a casual walk. A minute later, Fredrin followed. They walked together, without looking back. Eamon gripped the steering wheel tightly. He followed them, keeping a safe distance. They entered an expensive restaurant. He left his car and approached the window, staying hidden in the shadows. They sat across from each other. Fredrin leaned in closer, whispering something. Mirabella smiled. She looked happy. And then he saw Fredrin take her hand. Her fingers didn't pull away. On the contrary, she lightly squeezed his hand in return. Something inside Eamon snapped. He knew he wouldn't stop now. He knew his revenge would be ruthless. But he would wait a little longer. He would let them think they were in control. And then he would take everything from them. Eamon returned home earlier than usual. Fredrin and Mirabella hadn't yet come back from the restaurant, so the apartment was empty. He walked into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. His hands rested on his knees, clenched into fists. Everything he had seen today confirmed his worst suspicions. But instead of feeling anger or rage, he felt a strange, cold calm. He knew what to do. He would no longer be the victim. He would become the hunter. Mirabella and Fredrin didn't return for another 2 hours. Eamon heard them laughing in the hallway before the door opened. He stepped into the living room and greeted them with a warm smile. "How was dinner?" Mirabella held his gaze for a second, as if trying to assess his mood. "Wonderful, darling," she said, kissing him on the cheek. Her lips were warm, but he felt no sincerity in them. Fredrin smiled as well. "We had a nice chat, reminisced about old times," he said, sinking onto the couch in a relaxed manner. Eamon simply nodded. His fingers tightened around the phone in his pocket. The recording he made last night was still there, but he wasn't ready to use it just yet. No, first, he would make them expose themselves. The next morning, he discreetly placed his old phone on Mirabella's table. It was turned off, so she paid no attention to it. The trick was that he had turned on the voice recorder before leaving it there. He left the apartment under the pretense of running errands, but parked his car near the building. A few minutes later, he saw Fredrin leave as well. Mirabella was alone. Exactly what he had hoped for. When he returned 2 hours later, the phone was still where he had left it. He picked it up, stopped the recording, and walked to the bathroom. He put on his headphones and pressed play. At first, there was silence. Then, he heard Mirabella dialing someone. "He's gone," Her voice was light, carefree. A pause. Yes, tonight. He has a lot of work. He won't suspect a thing. Eamon felt something cold flood his veins. I don't know how much longer I can keep hiding this, she sighed. Another pause. Of course, I want to. I'm just afraid that if he finds out. Eamon stopped the recording. His grip on the phone was so tight his knuckles turned white. She was planning to meet him tonight, and she was sure he wouldn't find out. But this time, she was wrong. When evening came, Eamon pretended to be working in his office. Mirabella peeked inside, wearing the same dress he had once given her. Honey, I'm going to meet a friend, she said, smiling. Eamon lifted his head from his laptop and raised an eyebrow in feigned surprise. Oh, at this hour? She just laughed. Don't worry, I won't be long. He smiled back. All right, have a great time. She nodded and quickly left. A minute later, he heard the door close. Eamon stood up, grabbed his jacket, and followed her. He kept his distance, trailing behind her car. She was driving to a hotel on the outskirts of the city. Eamon parked on a nearby street and stepped out, staying in the shadows. He watched as she entered the building. A few minutes later, another car arrived. Fredrin. Eamon didn't feel anger. He felt only cold calculation. He took out his phone and snapped a few photos. Then, he dialed a number. Good evening. His voice was steady. Good evening. Who is this? Came the response on the other end. I'd like to report a violation happening at your establishment, Eamon said, staring at the hotel. Two guests are engaging in activities that might cause you some trouble. What kind of activities? Eamon smiled. They're using your hotel for meetings that the local authorities might not approve of. That's a serious accusation. The voice on the other end grew more cautious. Very serious, Eamon confirmed. Do you have any proof? I have photos and video, he replied, and I can send them to journalists. There was silence on the line. We'll investigate this matter, the operator finally said. Excellent. I'll wait. Eamon put his phone in his pocket and stared at the hotel entrance. He waited. 10 minutes later, two security guards approached the building. 5 minutes after that, the doors opened. Mirabella appeared in the lobby. Behind her, Fredrin. They looked confused as one of the guards spoke to them. Eamon couldn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. He saw their faces. They didn't know what had happened. They didn't know who had done this. But he knew. And this was only the beginning. Mirabella stood in the hotel lobby, trying to hide her panic. The security guard was saying something, but her mind refused to process it. Her heart pounded wildly, and sweat gathered on her palms. Fredrin beside her maintained a calm expression, but she could feel his tension. I don't understand what the problem is, she finally said, forcing a smile. The security guard looked at her with indifference. We received an anonymous call stating that meetings are taking place in this room that could be undesirable for the hotel's reputation. Mirabella nearly choked. This must be some kind of mistake. Fredrin stepped forward, his voice remaining calm. You do realize you're making baseless accusations against us? We're just doing our job, sir, the security guard replied. You're free to leave, but the hotel reserves the right to restrict your future stays here. Fredrin narrowed his eyes. In other words, you're kicking us out. The guard didn't respond. Mirabella took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Who could have made that call? Her thoughts raced as Fredrin gave the guards a cold nod and led her out of the hotel. They quickly reached the parking lot. Someone did this on purpose, she whispered. Obviously, Fredrin said, opening the door to his car. Get in. She wanted to argue, but then saw the change in his expression. He was starting to suspect something, and that was dangerous. Eamon sat in his car, watching as Fredrin and Mirabella quickly got into the vehicle and drove off. His lips curled into a slight smile. This was just a warning. They didn't yet realize that their perfect world was beginning to crumble. He typed out a message and sent it to Mirabella's phone. Are you home yet? The reply came almost instantly. Yes, the drive was exhausting. I'm going to bed now. Love you, my dear. Eamon's smile widened. She still thought she was in control. How foolish. The next morning, everything proceeded as usual. Mirabella made breakfast while Eamon sat at the table, scrolling through his phone. Fredrin, as always, appeared precisely at 9, fresh and confident. "How did you sleep?" he asked, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Wonderfully," Mirabella smiled at him, "just a little wider than usual." Eamon noticed. "Did you dream about something, darling?" he asked, feigning indifference. She blinked, as if caught off guard by the question. "No, why do you ask?" He shrugged. "You just look like you spent all night thinking about something important." Fredrin shifted his gaze to Mirabella. Eamon's tone was almost playful, but there was an underlying threat in his words. Mirabella let out a forced laugh. "Just tired." Eamon nodded, taking another sip of coffee. He was patient. He would give them time to relax, and then he would strike for real. That same day, he went to see a lawyer. He placed a folder on the table. "I need a divorce plan," he said calmly. The lawyer looked through the documents and sighed. "Are you sure? This is a serious decision." Eamon smiled. "I'm not just sure. I want her to walk away with nothing." The lawyer studied him carefully. "That's possible, but you'll need solid evidence." Eamon placed his phone on the table. "I already have it." He opened the recording of Mirabella and Fredrin's voices. The lawyer listened in silence. When the recording ended, he leaned back in his chair. "This is strong grounds for a divorce on your terms." Eamon smiled. "I know." He had already planned everything. All that was left was to wait and take the final step. That night, he lay in bed next to Mirabella. She was sleeping, her breathing steady. But Eamon was awake. He was thinking about what would come next. He was thinking about the day she would wake up and realize she had lost everything, and he would be there to see it. He glanced at the phone on the nightstand. Tomorrow, he would make his next move. He already knew exactly what it would be. Eamon woke up before everyone else. The sun had barely risen, and the house was silent. Mirabella was still asleep, wrapped in the blanket, and Fredrin was likely still in his room. Eamon sat on the edge of the bed and watched his wife for a few moments. Her face was peaceful, as if nothing troubled her. She had no idea that her world was about to shatter. Eamon smiled to himself. Just a little longer, just a little more, and everything would be ready. He quietly got up, took his phone, and stepped into the hallway. As he closed the door, he heard Mirabella shift in bed. He froze, but she didn't wake up. He had to move quickly. He went to his office and shut the door behind him. After visiting the lawyer, another idea had come to him, something that would turn everything upside down. He opened his laptop and logged into Fredrin's company database. He had access. A long time ago, when his father tried to involve him in the business, he had been given a corporate account. Fredrin thought he didn't understand his affairs, but he was wrong. Eamon quickly entered a few commands, bypassing the primary security. His fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard until the necessary information appeared on the screen. Accounting reports. Transactions that weren't officially documented. Money transfers to offshore accounts. Eamon narrowed his eyes. Fredrin had always portrayed himself as the perfect businessman. But, like everyone else, he had his dark secrets. Eamon copied the files onto a flash drive and disconnected from the system. Now he had another bargaining chip. But he wasn't going to use it just yet. First, he needed to be sure that Mirabella had completely crossed the line. That day, Eamon behaved differently. He became warmer, more attentive. He talked to Mirabella more, touched her hand, joked, and he noticed how she tensed. She hadn't expected this. "Is something wrong?" she asked during dinner. Eamon smiled, taking her palm in his hands. "I just want to be closer to you, darling." She blinked, as if unsure how to respond. Fredrin, sitting across from them, took a sip of wine and silently observed. Eamon noticed his father clench his jaw. Now it felt like a game. Who would make the first move? And he knew that moment was coming soon. That night, he once again turned on the voice recorder on his phone and left it on the table in the living room. This time, he pretended to go to bed early. But in reality, he was waiting for them to think he was asleep. Around midnight, he heard his bedroom door quietly open, then close again. Footsteps. Somewhere in the hallway. Eamon got up, took his phone, and crept to the door. He opened it as silently as he could. From downstairs, in the living room, voices drifted up. "He doesn't suspect anything?" Fredrin's voice. "No, Mirabella hesitated. "He's become more attentive," she continued. But I'm handling it. Eamon inhaled deeply. You need to act faster, Fredrin said. What do you mean? We need him to want to leave on his own. Eamon clenched his teeth. They weren't just sneaking around behind his back. They wanted to get rid of him. But how? Mirabella sounded nervous. I'll take care of it. Just keep doing what you're doing. Eamon gripped his phone tightly in his hand. Now he knew for sure. This was no longer just betrayal. This was betrayal on all levels. He stepped back into the darkness and returned to the bedroom. He was no longer angry. He no longer doubted. He was no longer a victim. Tomorrow, he would take action. Tomorrow, they would know what true fear was. The next day, he took the first step. He walked into Fredrin's office while he was working on his laptop. Dad, we need to talk. Fredrin looked up, his eyes calm, but something more lurked behind them. What happened, son? Eamon sat down across from him, placing his hands on his knees. I think we need to be honest with each other. Fredrin tilted his head slightly, studying him carefully. About what? Eamon smiled. About everything. He took out his phone and pressed play. Fredrin's voice came from the speaker. We need him to want to leave on his own. Something shifted sharply in his father's face. Eamon crossed his arms over his chest. What do you think Mirabella will say when I show her this? Fredrin didn't move. But for a moment, fear flashed in his eyes. You think you've won, he said quietly. Eamon leaned back in his chair. Oh no, he whispered, smiling slightly. This is just the beginning.